Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is just a little outline of what's going on today. We're going to be checking in on one of my ANC bins, and that stands for European Nightcrawler. The European Nightcrawler is a type of worm, and I've got a worm composting system that's been running for 155 days now. And it was during the 134 days that bin started. That's like 19, 20 weeks almost, I believe. It was at that point, I believe the bin had received 15 feedings over that time, and I decided that, well, you know what, it's about time that we start, gearing this system up for completion so we could harvest the castings, move the worms onto a new system to let them begin work there. And so I stopped feeding. That was 21 days ago, and that's what I usually refer to as foraging because there's still food in there. So the worms are just getting their food from the remaining little scraps within the material rather than being fed explicitly while I'm composting within the system. And after 21 days, we've had a few check-ins, and each time it's looked like the material has gotten more and more broken down. And at this point, after 3 weeks of having not gotten any food, they're going to get fed again. But this time, the feeding is for a very specific reason. I'm not just, composting at this point. I'm feeding them for the purposes of migrating them out of the system. So I'm feeding in a kind of a baiting fashion. Naturally, they're eating the food, they're making compost, so on and so forth. But at this point, the feeding is really geared so I can accomplish my goal, which is to migrate the worms out of the material that they inhabit right now. And the material that they inhabit is right down here within this bin that you see, covered with all kinds of different clutter and different things, which I'm going to explain really quickly. So it looks just like a regular feeding where you've got, some bedding materials. I've got a box of leaves too. You've got some food to give them, maybe some a little moisture if you need it, as well as some grit to go with the food. Typically, that's all you really need to feed, and that's what we got here. So we could set up the feeding zone, the migration feeding zone this time, not just any old feeding zone. And then something I like to do sometime, maybe when you saw this you probably knew right away what my game plan was. Sometimes I like to sort of create a little bit of a barrier wall between all of the material that's in the bin that's been pushed out to the side, separating it from the freshly built baiting area. So in this case, we're going to open up this side, push all the material over into a nice big mound so we can set up the feeding space over here, and then we'll use this punctured and then we'll use this pretty heavily perforated piece of cardboard, a little bit of a dividing wall. It's just something I like to do. A lot of people, when they do something like this to try to bait the worms over somewhere, they don't worry so much about trying to separate the areas. But for me, I just think it's easier to see that, hey, this is where the finished compost was, and this is the section where the worms have been recently migrated to, somewhat more fresh, unbroken down material. So if it comes time to separate those two sides, I sometimes find that division line helps a little bit. So these pieces of paper, all just little extra layers to keep the moisture in the bin a little bit. Perhaps not as much as if the plastic was covering it, but I usually kind of sparingly try to use the plastic, only if it's kind of a when needed sort of situation. Is with this worm? It's not moving. Is it dead? No, I just saw it move. Finally sprung to life. I wonder what's up with this little guy. Doesn't look too good. Hopefully that's not a sign of things to come with other worms maybe getting all drowsy like this little guy here for whatever reason. I don't know, when it comes to the use of the sieve, the screen, I've always kind of had this little kind of daydream about actually starting into this migration process with material that started out as being screened. So you would screen it, you would take all the large chunk that got stuck, put it on one side, you would take the really, really fine stuff and put it on the other side, and then push that already separated base material that you're beginning with over so you can actually set up the fresh feeding zone, and then the worms would make their way over. So I don't know, it's just an idea that I had, but it doesn't seem practical. I guess now I'm understanding why, because it is still pretty early on. It's very soon after feeding and composting that the material is all pretty damp and might not for the most part run through. Although I don't know, you grab a handful of this stuff and it seems pretty fluid. Maybe a little shaking would allow a good amount of it to flow through. So there's worms hanging out right here in the corner, the first spot we checked. There's also good chunks of food too, so I'm wondering how motivated these worms are going to be to move out if they've got all kinds of stuff to nibble on. So I do suppose a little aeration of the material throughout might help, but you know, I'm a little concerned about doing that. Last time I did that with one of my bins, the worms just freaked out. They all went climbing up the walls of the container trying to get out, and I would hate to disturb the worms so much that they would also feel like they've got to try to bug out. So now here, yeah, we had actually collected some of the large scraps of food that we had found in previous check-ins, and we were throwing them down into the bin in certain areas. So maybe we'll actually grab some of those things as we go and pull them out too. Big obvious chunks of food can certainly be pulled out, I think, in this process. So man, I am starting to wonder if I'm going to trip off another mass exodus by doing this. I don't remember ever doing this in the past and causing the worms to really bug out. So hopefully these worms are going to be relaxed enough to not freak out because of this big time tilling that I'm doing here. This is a pretty good sized chunk of leftover food too, a chunk of corn cob. I think we're going to pull that out too. So I guess it does sort of make sense to plow through the stuff if for no other reason than to pull out the large chunks. But I'm just kind of crossing my fingers here, hoping that we don't trip off another migration out of the bin like we saw with my blue worms last time I tilled up their material a lot like this. Because what I did in that bin to stop the movement of the worms up the walls of the container was I salted the walls of the container. So I mean, it's not harming the worms. They'll touch that salty surface and they'll sense that it's something that they don't want to be in contact with, and they'll pull away. So I mean, it's not like I'm pouring salt onto the worms. It's just putting salt on the material that I don't want the worms cruising around on, which is the walls of the container. And I guess there's that other end of the spectrum too, which says, hey, if they're, you know, that much in distress that they feel like they've just got to get out of their home, even braving the dry air outside of their bin, then there must be really something going haywire, which needs attention and shouldn't just be left, or left, you know, with worms occupying it, making them maybe uncomfortable, you know. But I guess if it's a toss-up between making worms uncomfortable and letting them react and run out into the dry space where they end up drying and dying, you know, maybe it is the better evil of two evils, or whatever the expression is, the lesser of two evils, right? To sort of force them to remain in the uncomfortable space that they will survive versus letting them, you know, run off into a space where they're certainly going to perish. So I don't know, some of the back and forth thinking that goes on in my head when I'm dealing with some of these matters. I think I've created a large enough opening here for us to create our feeding zone in. So you might have noticed I had some tubes, toilet paper tubes, which are about the right size to fit in here as sort of our backing or bottom support, so to speak, for our little wall that we're going to put up. I guess it'll also provide some nice airflow underneath each of these little tubes, which is kind of cool. And once the stuff gets damp and starts to collapse, it'll all, you know, close up those little cavernous spaces where there's airflow happening. But for a little while, it'll be like that. It'll be nice. So let's see, what other kind of stuff we got here? We got all kinds of cool bedding materials here that we can choose from. I've got a little bit of newspaper here, and the newspaper I'll typically want to combine with something, anything, to help it not clump. So here we'll use one of my typical additives, some leaves. We've already got a nice little foundation here for our horizontal migration feeding zone. Got my water bottle here too. This stuff is pretty dry, so I'd like to just dampen it a little. Alright, well, it's not bad. In a lot of cases I probably would have just threw that stuff in there dry, allowing for just the transfer of moisture from the bin and from the foods that they're going to get to hydrate, all that stuff. But I figured, if we can make this place as appealing as possible, then why not take that extra effort? Speaking of appealing, here's the peels of some cucumbers. I'll actually start placing the food in here for them. I can see these little guys are already checking out the feast being laid out for them. They're curious and they're probably interested. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure they don't know what the heck's going on. But after 3 weeks, I would assume that a little bit of fresh food is probably going to be a welcome thing in this bin. After all, they've really had to eat for a while now is just whatever little leftovers remained from the feeding they got last time 21 days ago, and whatever leftovers there were left from feedings prior to that. So we've got a nice little foundation here, but we've got quite a bit more space to backfill here. So why don't we start using some of these cardboard bits. I'll dump them all in. And we could throw in a little bit more of our varied bedding materials. Again, I like to use a little bit of leafy material in here too. Then I think we could start laying in perhaps the remainder of the food. I don't want to go too crazy here with all these layers. We're going to run out of space. And I'm sure this stuff is going to collapse down pretty quickly in a fairly short period of time because it's almost all air if you think about it. Okay. Oops. Well, let's proceed right to the coffee too. If the coffee's that anxious to get poured out. Let's do it. Let's get all the food in here, right? So that looks like a really tempting feeding zone. But I don't want to leave it exposed like this. I'd really like to cover it up a little bit better. Just because I've got, a variety of different like flying insects and things roaming around here within my wormery sometimes. Not, not like a huge amount, so it's not terrible, but once in a while I get a little flying insect or two, and I wouldn't want them to, catch a whiff of some sort of a delicious meal or feeding opportunity over here and come make pests of themselves. So I'll usually try to mask the scent of any sort of feedings with a good amount of bedding on top to cover it all up. So we've got to backfill our little retaining wall here, or a little, not even a retaining wall really, it's just a sort of a partition. It's a very welcoming partition, one with lots of holes in it to permit worm traffic to flow through it. So it's certainly not meant there to prevent any sort of worm movement. So look at that, I already got a worm crawling up the sides of the container. Geez, I really hope that doesn't end up becoming the outcome here. So I was pretty surprised, last time when I fed my my so-called mixed bin of worms. It's a bin that also has, or probably has, mostly Indian blue worms in it. And after I did a feeding like this where I had pretty much tilled up the entire contents of the entire container, I came back later in that day to just check in on the bin, not really going down there for that reason, but I figured as long as I was down there I'd take a peek inside the bin, and the whole side of the container was covered with worms trying to climb out. And I guess what I did was I wiped down the walls of the container with some salty water, and that definitely helped keep the worms down in the bedding, but it certainly didn't change or do away with what had originally caused them to start behaving that way in the first place. And my hope is that it was just a disruption I had caused by doing such a disruptive tilling of the material, and that it wasn't anything pertaining to the types of things that I had placed in that bin during that feeding. I mean, it happened only hours afterwards, or probably started happening immediately afterwards once I covered up the bin and walked away. So let's just hope that doesn't happen here too. So here I've got this other piece of cardboard that we can use as a little bit of a cover. Now, as far as covers are concerned, you saw that I had these two pieces of, you know what? I like the idea of coming up with a good number of different covers to place over the food. Not only to, to mask its scent from curious passerby insects, but Every layer also helps a little bit with keeping the moisture down within the system. So I had actually thought about bringing plastic back into this system as a covering only for this feeding area and leaving the rest of this covered with only paper and or cardboard. So here's the paper that's left from previously. Now it would only need to cover about this much, allowing the edges to dry. Doesn't matter if it's not that well covered. This material could use a little bit of drying. It doesn't need much, but it would probably help later in the game as a motivator for getting the worms to leave. So I've got a nice big plastic bag here that could easily cover the entire surface of this bin if it had to, but we're going to use it only to cover up the feeding area, creating a little bit of a sort of a terrarium effect where any moisture that would otherwise evaporate out into the atmosphere is just going to stay stuck under that plastic and create a nice little humid, damp zone where the moisture continues recirculating and making that into a nice, cozy, tempting place where the worms definitely want to be, as opposed to this section of the bin that's kind of already in the process of drying out. I mean, I'm even thinking of maybe trying to prop up this side of the bin a little bit, or the coverings, to allow for a little bit more airflow to happen beneath it. Well, you know, for now it doesn't matter so much. I could always come in here and prop that up with a little something to help increase airflow, but I think this will be good for now. So we'll see how this goes. So my 155-day-old African nightcrawler system is now past its composting phase, now complete with its foraging phase, and starting into its migration phase. So I'm wondering how long it's going to take to get these worms to move out. I guess we'll have to see. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.